Hi everyone, my name's Anthony. Today I'd like to discuss DSLR sensor size. Very contentious issue. All over YouTube there are videos for and against crop sensor, full frame sensor. One is better, one is worse, etc, etc. So for what it was worth, I wanted to put a slightly different perspective on it. To start with, I'd like to revert back to the days of film, which is not that long ago. The days of film, there was 35mm, there was medium format, and there was large format. Now for anything of any importance outside of journalism, sports, no serious photographer would use 35mm. For weddings, in the 70s, in the 80s and beyond, any professional, serious photographer would be using medium format, 6x6, Hasselblad, or often Bronica Square. In a studio, they'd be using as a minimum Mamiya 6x7, which gives lovely large slides or negatives about this size. And for important work, large format sheet film, 4x5, 7x5, 8x10. Because from 35mm to 6x6 or 6x7, that is a big difference. From 35mm to slide film, sheet film rather, that is a big difference. But 35mm to a crop frame sensor, the difference is negligible. Negligible. We are talking about a collection of pixels that gather information, and that information is processed. That is why technology is changing things with the introduction of every camera. Now moving on to digital, we've got, for example, now the D7200, which is 24 megapixel, D500, which is 20 megapixel. We've got the D850, which is up to 47 megapixels, and we've got Hasselblad back, which is 100 megapixels. In fact, it has sort of dual pixel technology, one of their backs, that it effectively creates a 200 megapixel image, even though it's a 100 megapixel back. It's very clever technology, but it still is in fact a 100 megapixel back. Now, has anybody noticed that crop frame sensors seem to have stopped at 24 megapixel for at least the last 2-3 years? They've not gone beyond that, with the exception of a couple like the NX5, I believe, that's 27 or 28, but that's backside illuminated. It's slightly different technology, but basically they've settled at 24. Now, full frame sensors have continued to increase their megapixel count to 45, 50, just over 50. But crop frame sensors have stayed at 24. Well, here's some figures. On the D7200 at 24 megapixels, it has a pixel pitch of 3.9. The D500, which is 20 megapixels, has a pixel pitch size of 4.2 microns. The D850 at 47 megapixels has a pixel pitch of 4.3 microns. Basically, identical sensor to the D500. If you were to take the D850 sensor and trim 30% of it, you would have the D500 sensor. It really annoys me when I hear people again and again and again talk on different YouTube channels about a full frame sensor gathering more light. It does not gather more light. It simply has room for more pixels or larger pixels with less megapixels. But it is the pixels that are the eyes. They are what gathers the light. The individual pixels do not know or care or are influenced by how many others there are. If you take an image on a D850 sensor and trim it to a crop frame sensor, that image will be exactly the same, regardless of whether the light is less or more. Just because you haven't trimmed it and it's a full frame sensor, that crop section in the middle will not perform better in more light or less light. It is not affected. It is the individual pixels. Now, as the camera resolution has increased, the size of the pixels has shrunk. And 3.9 is basically the limit where they cannot get any smaller without dynamic range going to pot. Hence the reason that crop frame sensors have stopped at 24 and full frame sensors have been gradually pushing ahead to 50 and a little beyond, which will be their limit. Medium format sensor like the Hasselblad has gone up to 100, which is nearing its limit. It can go a little further. So, for all intents and purposes, doesn't matter, the actual low light performance difference is negligible now. Now, the D750, which is full frame but only 24 megapixels, and the D5, which is a full frame sensor and only 20 megapixels, yes, they have a much larger pixel pitch, and they will perform much better in low light than either the D850 or the D7200. But it is down to the pixel pitch, not the size of the sensor. Choosing a full frame sensor, though, can be influenced by other factors. Personally, as somebody who entered photography with 35mm film, which is the same as a full frame sensor, I would prefer a full frame camera so that I can use lenses at their native focal length. Most people for portraiture, say on a crop sensor, maybe would use a 50mm, which has an effective field of view of 75mm with a 1.5 crop multiplier. But that does not make the lens 75mm. It is still a 50mm lens. Personally, I prefer the compression of the butter lens, the 85mm lens. I think that for me is the sweet spot of portraiture. I think it is gorgeous. But place that on a crop frame sensor and it has an effective field of view of around 127, 128mm, making anything more than a very tight headshot, meaning you've got to be halfway across the room. It's just not practical. It works fine if you're using a 50mm, but for me, as I said, it may have an effective field of view of 75, but it is not a 75. It is a 50mm. It has the same compression as a 50, not an 85. And for that reason, I would prefer the size of a full frame sensor so that I can use lenses at their native focal length. And obviously, as you go beyond that, the crop factor becomes even more exaggerated if you put a 70-200 or the nickel 80-200 on a DX body. It's basically the 80-200 becomes a 120-300. As I said, with a 120 effective focal length, minimum focal length, you've got to be the other side of the room just to get anything more than a headshot. It's just too much. I prefer full frame for that reason. I don't need full frame for extra low light performance, not anymore. Dynamic range, not anymore. It's not about that. It's not about IQ. It is purely for me the choice of lenses that I would use for what I want. On the other hand, if you're more into street photography or landscape photography, unless of course you wanted the ultimate resolution of the D850, crop frame is perfect. There are many situations where it is fine, it is perfect, but make the choice for the right reasons. It's not about upgrading. Each one has its own qualities. If we're going to talk about ultimate quality, then the difference between crop frame or full frame and medium format, now that is a jump. That is significant. That is worth discussing. But squabbling over the difference of a crop sensor and a full frame sensor, really, it's a waste of time. that doesn't make any difference at all. At the end of the day, photography is about light, and the order of importance is light, creativity, lens, camera. Camera is last. Back soon.